have produced a disciplined answer. It should have produced a clear statement of American objectives, a clear statement of military limits, and a clear statement of what Washington believes it can realistically achieve. Instead, what the world heard was confusion. The president suggested that maybe he and the Ayatollah would run it together. Think about that for a moment. The United States has entered a military crisis over one of the most important energy choke points on Earth, a waterway through which a major share of global oil traffic moves. And the answer from the commander in chief was not strategy, it was improvisation. That matters because in war, words are not harmless. Words signal intent. Words shape markets. Words influence allies. Words tell enemies whether the person across the table understands the battlefield or is simply trying to survive the next press conference. When a president says he is seeking regime change and then in the same breath says he respects reasonable people inside the same government he claims must be replaced, that is not clever diplomacy. That is contradiction. You cannot credibly say you are removing a government while also saying you are negotiating with that government as a serious partner. You cannot threaten a state's survival and then expect that state to trust your back channel message. That is not how diplomacy works. That is not how deterrence works. And it is certainly not how you manage a crisis in the Persian Gulf. The official story is that some kind of deal is being discussed, that channels are open, that progress is happening, and that Washington is somehow moving toward a controlled outcome. But the Iranian side has denied this directly, not with vague diplomatic language, not with the kind of carefully crafted denial that leaves room for secret talks. They have said there are no negotiations, no direct contacts, no indirect contacts, no serious process underway. So now we are left with two possibilities. Either Iran is lying publicly while quietly negotiating behind the scenes, or Washington is describing a diplomatic process that does not exist in any meaningful operational form. And if the second possibility is true, then this is not just political messaging, this is a governance problem. Stay with this, because the next layer is where the official story begins to fall apart. When a government is losing control of the strategic situation, it often begins to replace reality with narrative. It begins to speak about progress where there is stalemate. It begins to speak about leverage where there is exhaustion. It begins to speak about deals where there are only demands. That is what we may be seeing here. The United States launched or supported a campaign built around the assumption that pressure would force Iran into submission. But Iran did not submit. The Strait of Hormuz did not become an American controlled lane. The Iranian government did not collapse. The nuclear file did not disappear. Regional resistance networks did not simply evaporate, and the economic consequences did not remain contained inside Iran. This is the trap Washington is now facing. If it walks away, it looks like defeat. If it continues, the economic and military costs grow. If it escalates, it risks a regional war that could hit American bases, Gulf infrastructure, global shipping, energy markets, and the domestic economy all at once. That is not a position of strength. That is a strategic trap created by bad assumptions. And the first bad assumption was that Iran would behave like a weak state under pressure. Iran is not weak in the way Washington planners wanted it to be weak. It has vulnerabilities, yes. It has economic pressure, yes. But it also has depth, geography, missile forces, regional connections, land routes, overland trade corridors, and the political will that comes from fighting what it sees as an existential struggle. The second bad assumption was that American air power could create political surrender. That is a recurring disease in Washington. The belief that if enough targets are hit, the enemy's political system will crack. We saw this thinking in Iraq. We saw it in Libya. We saw it in Afghanistan. And now we see it again around Iran. But air power can destroy infrastructure. It cannot guarantee political surrender. It can damage military capacity. It cannot erase national will. It can impose costs. It cannot automatically produce a government willing to accept terms written in Washington or Tel Aviv. That distinction matters. Military power is a tool. It is not a strategy by itself. The third bad assumption was that the economic pain would be one-sided. It has not been. The disruption of Gulf energy flows affects the world. It affects oil prices, fertilizer, shipping, aviation fuel, industrial inputs, consumer prices, and political stability in countries that had no vote in this crisis. When fuel prices rise, American households feel it. When fertilizer costs rise, farmers feel it. When jet fuel becomes expensive, airlines feel it. When supply chains begin to choke, voters feel it. And once voters feel a war in their grocery bills, fuel bills, and daily costs, the political calculation changes very quickly. But if you think that was the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious. The question is not only whether the policy failed, the question is whether the system still has the ability to correct the failure. In a functioning government, the intelligence community provides hard assessments. The military gives professional judgment. Diplomats report the reality of negotiations. Congress provides oversight. The press asks serious questions. And the president is forced to deal with facts, not slogans. But when those correction mechanisms break down, bad policy does not stop. It compounds. The signs of breakdown are visible. A small circle makes enormous decisions. Professional military judgment is sidelined. Intelligence warnings are ignored or punished. Congressional authority is treated as an inconvenience. Public explanations shift from one day to the next. Officials claim negotiations while the other side denies they exist. Markets react to physical shortages while politicians talk about progress. This is not how a serious power manages war. This is how a system drifts into deeper crisis while pretending it is still in control. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. If analysts inside the government understand that the official narrative is wrong but are afraid to say so, the decision maker becomes increasingly isolated from reality. That is one of the most dangerous situations in national security. Leaders do not make catastrophic decisions only because they are aggressive. They make catastrophic decisions because they are misinformed, insulated, flattered, pressured, or surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear. Intelligence is supposed to prevent that. It is supposed to tell uncomfortable truths. But if the system punishes uncomfortable truths, then intelligence stops being intelligence and becomes political decoration. That matters in the Strait of Hormuz because this is not a symbolic battlefield. This is geography with consequences. Hormuz is narrow, it is vulnerable, it is surrounded by missile ranges, naval assets, drones, fast boats, coastal batteries, mines, and surveillance systems. Any serious military planner knows that keeping that waterway open under hostile conditions is not a simple task. It requires constant naval presence, air defense, mine countermeasures, escort operations, intelligence, logistics, and cooperation from regional states. And even then, full control is an illusion. You can reduce risk, you can deter attacks, you can retaliate, but you cannot make the geography disappear. Iran understands this geography better than Washington does because Iran lives there. Iran does not need to defeat the US Navy in a conventional blue water battle. That is not the Iranian concept. Iran only needs to make the cost of operating in the Gulf politically and economically unbearable. It can use missiles, drones, mines, coastal defense, swarming tactics, cyber tools, and proxy pressure. It can strike selectively, deny responsibility when useful, escalate gradually, and force Washington to defend every tanker, every base, every port, every pipeline, every aircraft, and every allied facility. That is asymmetric warfare. It is not glamorous, but it is effective when the objective is denial rather than conquest. Washington's problem is that it keeps thinking in terms of dominance. Iran thinks in terms of denial. Those are different concepts. The United States wants to control the battle space. Iran wants to make control too expensive. The United States wants freedom of navigation. Iran wants leverage over the choke point. The United States wants a clean military solution. Iran wants a political outcome shaped by endurance. If you do not understand the enemy's theory of victory, you will misunderstand the war. Now let us look at the claim that a deal is coming. A real deal requires leverage, clarity, trust, and channels. Washington has damaged all four. Its leverage is weaker because the military campaign has not produced the promised collapse. Its clarity is weaker because officials send mixed messages about regime change, negotiation, respect, threats, and partnership. Its trust is non existent because the United States has a long record of breaking or abandoning agreements with Iran, and its channels are uncertain because the Iranian side denies that the claimed contacts even exist. That is not a negotiating position. That is confusion dressed up as diplomacy. Iran's public position has been much more consistent. It wants an end to American military pressure. It wants sanctions relief. It wants frozen assets released. It wants recognition of its security interests. It wants the U.S. presence in the Gulf reduced or removed from the bases used against it. And it wants the new reality of Hormuz acknowledged. Whether one agrees with those demands is not the point. The point is that Iran's position is coherent. Washington's position is not. In diplomacy, coherence matters. A state that knows what it wants has an advantage over a state that only knows what it refuses to admit. The United States says Iran must back down. Iran says the United States must leave. The United States says it has a deal. Iran says there is no deal. The United States says it controls escalation. Iran says it controls the geography. The United States says pressure is working. The markets say pressure is spreading. That gap between narrative and reality is the core of the crisis. By the end, you will understand why this is not just about missiles or bases. It is about credibility, deterrence, and the failure of strategic judgment. American credibility is not destroyed by one battlefield loss. It is destroyed when Washington repeatedly makes promises it cannot enforce, issues threats it cannot back without unacceptable costs, and starts conflicts without defining achievable end states. Allies notice that. Adversaries notice that. Neutral states notice that. The Gulf states notice. Russia notices. China notices. Europe notices. And every country dependent on American security guarantees begins asking whether Washington still understands the difference between power and strategy. Russia is one of the major beneficiaries of this crisis. That is not because Russia controls every event. It does not. But Russia benefits when the United States is distracted, overstretched, economically pressured, and diplomatically isolated. If oil prices rise, Russian revenue improves. If Washington diverts attention to Iran, pressure on Ukraine becomes harder to sustain. If Gulf states begin looking for alternative security structures, Moscow and Beijing gain diplomatic space. If American weapons inventories are drained, Russia watches with interest. That is how strategic competition works. You do not need to fire the shot to benefit from the result. China benefits as well, but in a different way. China watches the Gulf because it depends heavily on energy flows. It watches American decisions because it is evaluating U.S. judgment. It watches the reaction of allies because it wants to know how much confidence remains in American leadership, and it watches the weapon consumption rate, the logistics stress, the political divisions, and the economic impact. Every crisis is also an intelligence collection opportunity. Beijing is learning from this. Moscow is learning from this. Tehran is learning from this. The question is whether Washington is learning anything at all. The evidence so far is not encouraging. Instead of reassessment, we see message management. Instead of congressional seriousness, we see hesitation. Instead of a clear strategy, we see claims of progress without proof. Instead of admitting military limits, we see the same old language about strength and resolve. But strength without judgment is dangerous. Resolve without strategy is reckless. And escalation without an achievable political objective is how great powers damage themselves. Look at the constitutional issue. The American system does not give one person unlimited authority to drag the country into war. Congress has war powers for a reason. Public deliberation matters because war affects the whole nation. It affects soldiers, families, markets, farmers, workers, allies, and future generations. If a conflict of this scale can be launched, extended, reframed, and managed through procedural tricks while Congress stands aside, then the problem is bigger than one president. It is institutional decay. It is the failure of the constitutional system to perform its most serious function. This is not a minor technicality, it is central. Wars started without serious oversight often become wars without clear endings. When the executive branch can define the conflict, redefine the mission, pause and restart timelines, and avoid meaningful accountability, then policy becomes detached from democratic legitimacy. That is dangerous in any conflict. It is especially dangerous in a conflict involving Iran, Hormuz, global oil supply, and the possibility of direct confrontation with broader regional networks. The economic side is just as serious. Energy shocks do not stay isolated, they move through everything. Oil becomes gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, plastics, shipping costs, fertilizer inputs, food prices, and industrial production costs. If fertilizer becomes too expensive, farmers reduce application. If farmers reduce application, yields fall later. If yields fall, food prices rise months after the political class has moved on to another talking point. That is how wars create delayed domestic consequences. The public may not understand the chain at first, but they feel the bill when it arrives. Airlines cutting routes because fuel costs rise is not an abstract geopolitical story. It affects travel, logistics, tourism, business, and consumer prices. Motor oil shortages, diesel pressure, and shipping disruptions are not dramatic battlefield images, but they are strategic realities. Modern economies depend on energy predictability. When that predictability disappears, political pressure builds fast. That is why the idea that this crisis can be managed through speeches is absurd. Physical supply cannot be talked into existence. Markets understand this faster than politicians do. When markets move in the direction of crisis while officials speak about progress, pay attention to the markets, not because markets are always wise, but because they respond to risk with money on the line. If traders, insurers, shipping companies, energy buyers, and industrial firms behave as if the crisis is worsening, that tells you something. They are not voting in a press conference. They are pricing consequences. The United States still has enormous power. Nobody serious denies that, but power must be applied intelligently. Aircraft carriers do not solve every political problem. Bombers do not create legitimacy. Sanctions do not always create surrender. Intelligence does not matter if it is ignored. Alliances do not remain strong if allies believe they are being dragged into disasters. And deterrence does not work if the adversary concludes you are more afraid of the consequences than he is. Iran appears to have made that calculation. It has watched the economic pressure spread outward. It has watched Washington struggle to define the end state. It has watched regional partners hesitate to fully align with the American position. It has watched Russia and China exploit the opening. It has watched domestic American politics become more fragile as prices rise. And it has decided, at least for now, that endurance serves its interests better than concession. That does not mean Iran is invincible. It is not. Iran can be hurt. Its economy can suffer. Its infrastructure can be damaged. Its military systems can be targeted. Its people can face hardship. But the relevant question in war is not whether a country can be hurt. The relevant question is whether hurting it produces the political outcome you want. In this case, the answer appears to be no. The pressure has not produced surrender. It has produced escalation, resistance, and a stronger Iranian insistence on its terms. That is the central failure. Washington confused punishment with strategy. Punishment can be part of strategy, but it is not strategy by itself. If you cannot explain how punishment produces the desired political outcome, then you do not have a strategy. You have violence with talking points. The media environment makes this worse. Viewers are fed simple narratives. America is strong, Iran is desperate, Israel is threatened, Russia is exploiting, China is watching, and a deal is close. But serious analysis requires more than slogans. It requires asking what objectives have been achieved. Is the Iranian government gone? No. Is the nuclear program eliminated? No. Is Hormuz securely under American control? No. Are energy markets stable? No. Are allies more confident? No. Are adversaries more deterred? That is very questionable. So, what exactly was gained? That is the question the architects of this policy do not want to answer. They want to talk about toughness. They want to talk about pressure. They want to talk about secret contacts. They want to talk about future deals. But the battlefield and the market do not care about rhetoric. They care about reality. And reality says this conflict has created a strategic environment more dangerous for the United States than the one that existed before. The most dangerous moment in any failed strategy is the moment when leaders realize they are failing but cannot admit it. That is when they escalate to avoid humiliation. That is when they expand objectives instead of narrowing them. That is when they blame intelligence, allies, the media, or domestic opponents. That is when they invent diplomatic progress to buy time. That is when they begin making decisions not to win the war, but to protect the narrative. And wars fought to protect narratives are among the most dangerous wars of all. The president's statement about sharing control of Hormuz with the Ayatollah may have been casual language, but casual language in a crisis can reveal serious confusion. Is the objective control? Is it shared management? Is it regime change? Is it a ceasefire? Is it negotiation? Is it punishment? Is it deterrence? Is it protection of shipping? Is it protection of Israel? Is it domestic political survival? If the administration cannot answer that question clearly, then it cannot build a coherent policy. The same applies to the military. What is the mission? To destroy Iran's nuclear program, to protect shipping, to force negotiations, to weaken the Iranian government, to reassure Israel, to contain Russia and China, to stabilize energy markets. These are not the same mission. They require different resources, different timelines, different legal authorities, different diplomatic arrangements, and different measures of success. When policymakers blend them together, the military is left executing operations without a clear political end state. That is how mission creep begins. The professional military understands this. Serious officers understand logistics, geography, escalation, and limits. They understand that Iran is not a small target set. They understand that the Gulf is not an empty ocean. They understand that American bases are vulnerable. They understand that missile defense is not perfect. They understand that ammunition inventories are finite. They understand that naval operations under constant threat impose enormous strain. And they understand that if the political leadership keeps shifting the objective, the military burden grows without strategic clarity. Intelligence professionals understand it too. They understand the difference between claims and evidence. They understand when diplomatic channels exist and when they are being exaggerated. They understand when an enemy is under pressure and when he is merely absorbing pain. They understand when markets are signaling a deeper crisis. But if their assessments are ignored or punished, then the system becomes blind by choice. This is the final warning. Military escalation in the Persian Gulf is not a television drama. It is not a campaign slogan. It is not a way to repair poll numbers. It is not a tool for proving toughness. It is a high risk confrontation in a region where geography favors disruption, where missiles can change economic conditions overnight, where allies are nervous, where adversaries are watching, and where one miscalculation can create consequences no one can fully control. If Washington continues to mistake statements for strategy, if it continues to confuse airstrikes with political success, if it continues to claim negotiations that the other side denies, if Congress continues to avoid its constitutional responsibility, and if intelligence professionals are punished for telling the truth, then the United States will not be managing this crisis. It will be drifting inside it. And drift is dangerous. Drift is how wars expand. Drift is how red lines blur. Drift is how leaders convince themselves they have more control than they do. Drift is how a regional confrontation becomes a global economic shock. Drift is how great powers damage their own credibility while insisting they are defending it. The Strait of Hormuz is not controlled by slogans. Iran is not defeated by press conferences. Markets are not stabilized by wishful thinking. Allies are not reassured by contradiction. And adversaries are not deterred by a government that cannot clearly explain what it is trying to achieve. The hard truth is that America's problem right now is not only Iran, it is not only Russia, it is not only China, it is not only oil prices or missile threats or regional instability. The deeper problem is strategic incompetence, the willingness to enter a crisis without a realistic end state, to ignore intelligence when it is inconvenient, to bypass constitutional process when it is difficult, and to sell the public a narrative that does not match operational reality. Bad policy does not become good policy because it is repeated with confidence. A failed strategy does not become successful because officials call it resolve. And a war without a clear end state does not become manageable because someone says a deal is coming. The world is watching. Iran is watching. Russia is watching. China is watching. The Gulf states are watching. American allies are watching. And the lesson they draw will not come from speeches. It will come from results. So far, the results are clear. The objectives have not been achieved. The costs are rising. The exit is unclear. And the official story is separating further from the facts on the ground. That is how dangerous strategic moments are born. Not all at once, not with one dramatic announcement, but through a series of bad assumptions, weak oversight, false confidence, ignored intelligence, economic pressure, and leaders who believe they can control escalation simply because they started it. History is not kind to governments that confuse momentum with success. And if Washington does not correct course soon, this crisis will not simply expose the weakness of one policy, it will expose the weakness of an entire decision making system that forgot the first rule of strategy: never start a conflict unless you understand how it ends.